From 7th and Walnut right here in Bloomington, Indiana, welcome back to IU Sports Sunday. Nick Rotacap with you on this Labor Day weekend. It's been over 3 months since we were last here, and I can tell you, as an insider, it is very good to be back. Indiana football opened its season yesterday. 27-14 winners over Old Dominion. I was there covering the game, as I will be for every game for the Hoosier Network, one of the student media outlets on IU's campus. If this is your first time joining us on this Sunday during the school year, welcome. I am a student at Indiana University, very privileged to get this opportunity from Kent Sterling to come back to WGCL and anchor this show throughout the academic year. It'll be right here on WGCL from 8 to 10 a.m. And if you want to find it on social media, follow me on X at Nick Rotacap, NickRodecap. We'll have clips, and the full episodes will go up on my YouTube channel as well. So, we have a lot to talk about. Mostly because, as I said, it's been over 3 months since I last did this show. What have I been up to in that time? Well, I don't want to make it too much about myself, but I was down in the Appy League, the Appalachian League, which is a collegiate woodbat summer baseball league, primarily focusing on college freshmen and sophomores, improving their skills on the diamond. I was working for the Greenville Flyboys. Want to thank their general manager, Brandon Bouchard, for giving me the opportunity. I did every game, supposed to be 48. We had a couple of rainouts. So it ended up being 46 games in 56 days, and I improved massively as a play-by-play broadcaster in that time, also honing my skills as a writer even further, and I am very glad that I went down to Greenville and took that opportunity. Can't believe I'm a senior at IU, but this is the last go-round before I graduate in May of 2026. Now, this is year 2 for head coach Curt Cignetti. It's also year 2 for me covering IU football. I've also got experience covering Indiana baseball, and I'll cover the basketball team for the first time. First year under head coach Darren DeVries. Also some experience covering swim and dive. But baseball, definitely my forte. Getting more and more comfortable with football, though, by the day from the media side of things. And one thing that Curt Cignetti made very clear after Indiana's unconvincing 27-14 win over Old Dominion yesterday is that he is not pleased with the way Indiana played. He opened his press conference, and you could tell by the look on his face and his body language that that was kind of the most likely sentiment, and definitely it makes sense. But he said, quote, "I guarantee you, everyone in this organization realizes we didn't play as well as we wanted to. That's just a flat-out fact." And yeah, Coach, nobody's going to argue with you there, especially when after the electrifying entrance and debut of Hoosier the Bison, the new mascot for Indiana, which, by the way, they absolutely nailed that costume. It looks pretty freaking cool, and we had a special run-in with Hoosier the Bison that I'll get to a little bit later. But the first play from scrimmage, after the crowd was juiced up, and I said to one of my friends, this almost feels like an October game from last year, whether that's Nebraska or Washington, both of which were sellouts. This was not, but it was close at kickoff. Old Dominion quarterback Colton Joseph completely deflated the place, just like a balloon. 75 yards to the house on the first play from scrimmage on a busted assignment on what should have been a pretty routine zone read. Remember how last season Indiana did not trail until the 9th game of the season? That was at Michigan State when the Spartans took a 10-0 lead. Well, this season, Indiana trailed after 11 seconds of game time. Now, obviously, the 8 games without trailing streak, if you want to call it that, was partly the product of Indiana's offense firing on all cylinders from, well, actually, I shouldn't say that. Firing on all cylinders, certainly from game 2, not from game 1. The difference is, I think, Old Dominion's offense just took advantage of a couple busted assignments, and that was something that Cignetti talked about. He said that there was a missed assignment on the first play, and then there was another one on pretty much the exact same play in the fourth quarter. Colton Joseph had 2 separate touchdown runs over 75 yards, which, yeah, you ideally want no missed assignments because that gives you a chance to really keep Old Dominion from doing anything offensively. And I know how this is going to sound taking the bad plays out of the equation. But if you take away the two busted assignments that Indiana had on those zone reads, which led to a 75 and a 78-yard touchdown run, respectively, from the talented dual-threat quarterback Colton Joseph, those two plays alone accounted for 153 yards of offense for Old Dominion. For the entire game, the Monarchs had just 314 yards of total offense. 218 of those came on the ground. 153 of those from two plays. So if you take away those two missed assignments, all else equal, Old Dominion had 65 rushing yards. Now, obviously, you can't just take away those two plays and assume that the game plays out in the exact same fashion. But the key stat for me, there are a couple. And it's, you never want to just box score watch. And again, I was there covering the game. I shot the game. I shot every play. The key thing for me, number one, Old Dominion did not snap the ball on the plus side of the 50 one time, if you can believe that. Now, you think, they averaged 9.5 yards per rush. They had 218 rushing yards on 23 carries, did the Monarchs. But, again, those two busted plays came from Old Dominion's own 25 or closer to its own end zone. And credit Colton Joseph, credit the offensive line. They found something, some weakness, and somebody on Indiana missed contain on the outside. The defense, outside of those two plays, though, in my opinion, and in that of more football knowledgeable voices, such as former Indiana center Mike Kadick, said that the defense looked great. And I think another key stat from this game, Indiana winning 27-14 over Old Dominion in a Week 1 win that Curt Cignetti emphasized. Indiana did not play as well as it should have, and everybody in the organization knows that. His quote. Mike Kadick said the same thing that I said. The red zone offense needs work. I called it subpar yesterday on X. You can follow me at Nick Rotacap for more rocket scientist level analysis. I'm being facetious there because it's not at all rocket science to measure Indiana's red zone efficiency as subpar. But Indiana absolutely looked great on defense apart from those two missed assignments. 3 interceptions, one by Amari Farrell, one by the newly maybe eligible Lewis Moore, and one on a tip drill by none other than potential All-American D'Angelo Pons. A day that ends in Y. D'Angelo Pons finds a way to make an impact on the game. But Indiana, 3 interceptions, which, that you'll take that performance from the secondary all day long. Colton Joseph, his passing line, very unimpressive. A 50% completion percentage, 11 for 22, 96 yards and 3 picks. No touchdowns in the air. So Indiana's passing defense looked great. Indiana's defense did. They forced Old Dominion to punt 6 times, and one of those punts led to one of the longest punt return touchdowns in IU football history, coming from Cal transfer Jonathan Brady, 91 yards to the house. That was a play that Cignetti emphasized after the game as saying Indiana absolutely needed it, because at that point, Old Dominion was up 7-0, and although the Monarchs had been forced to punt, they were finding ways, it seemed, to get the ball near midfield and to threaten Indiana defensively. So for Brady to take that one 91 yards to the house after Indiana's offense had just failed inside the red zone, we'll get to that a little bit later. Jonathan Brady's 91-yard punt return touchdown gave Indiana a lift, as did the multiple turnovers that Indiana was able to force defensively. So that is definitely a bright spot to take away from yesterday's 27-14 win over Old Dominion. Now, I don't want to be too reactionary, but I feel like if Old Dominion, and I know we're using the word if in college football discourse, if I had wheels, I'd be a bicycle. But I think if Old Dominion irons out some of the unforced mistakes, I feel like it's not exactly going out on a limb to say that Sunbelt defenses are not going to be as talented in the secondary as Indiana. I feel like if Old Dominion irons out those turnovers, and also Old Dominion took a lot of penalties. Indiana got 3 first downs off of Old Dominion penalties. And it seemed like every single time there was a flag on the field, it was going against Old Dominion. So that's something they are absolutely going to look at ironing out in the future. But if Old Dominion cleans up some of the Week 1 boo-boos, they could definitely have a shot at winning the Sun Belt. And again, that sounds a little reactionary, but they gave Indiana a scare yesterday. There's no way of twisting that. So we'll talk more about Indiana's Week 1 victory over Old Dominion, also the chaos around college football in Week 1, and why, as I, along with many other people, have been saying for a while now, the Week 1 / preseason rankings are absolute garbage, and in my opinion, they should be abolished. Keep it right here on WGCL. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday. Back here on IU Sports Sunday, the first show of the 2025-26 academic year. Nick Rittercap with you here on this Labor Day weekend. Week 1 of college football is not yet fully in the books. A couple big games tonight. Of course, the one everybody's got circled. Miami hosting Notre Dame in a battle of perennially overrated brands, especially Miami. I'll give Notre Dame credit, of course, as the defending national championship runner-up. And Indiana, ESPN ran an interesting note on the ticker yesterday, and I wanted to touch upon this because I think it's important that we do note that Indiana has beaten 12 consecutive unranked opponents, but is 0-2 against ranked teams in that time. Although I believe at the time Indiana beat Nebraska, the Huskers were 25th in the coaches poll. So if you really want to grasp at straws, technically Indiana has beaten a ranked team. But Indiana 0-2 against ranked teams under Curt Cignetti, and I think it's fair to say that if Indiana plays the way it did yesterday against any of the teams that will likely be ranked when they face off, that would be Illinois, Oregon, and, of course, Penn State, barring a collapse in the eyes of the AP voters, Indiana would lose. I know, getting into hypotheticals where Indiana loses, I sound like an ESPN talking head. But if you watched the game yesterday, it was very unconvincing, which is weird because that's not what the numbers tell you. And this is why it's important to do more than box score watch if you're going to talk about any sport, really, but especially football. Indiana had over 500 total yards of offense, and 300 of those came on the ground. So you're thinking, okay, surely this was kind of a blowout, right? 3 times as many first downs as Old Dominion. Indiana had 30 first downs. The Hoosiers averaged 5.4 yards per carry on 57 rushing attempts. But they only scored 27 points, and only 14 of those came from offensive touchdowns. Indiana only had a couple of offensive touchdowns. The Hoosiers had 7 trips to the red zone yesterday, possessed the ball for over 2/3 of the game, and only scored 2 offensive touchdowns. Rushing touchdowns from both Kalen Black and Fernando Mendoza. Indiana also failed to score in the red zone on 3 occasions and scored twice via red zone field goals, which it felt like Indiana never did last year. I'm sure it happened a couple times, but off the top of my head, as someone who was at 11 of 13 games and covered all 13, I don't remember many times at all when Indiana struggled multiple times in the same game in the red zone. Usually, when they got there, the Hoosiers found pay dirt. And Curt Cignetti talked about this after the game as well. He said, quote, "We had a number of missed opportunities offensively. 1st and 2 on the 2, couldn't get the ball in the end zone. Get down there next time and fumbled the ball." That was Lee Beebe's first carry for Indiana, was a fumble inside the red zone. Cignetti continues, got open for a touchdown, make a nice throw, and he drops the ball, referring to Omar Cooper, who had a couple of drops yesterday. That was tough because one of them would have been a wide open deep ball for a touchdown. A beautiful throw from Fernando Mendoza. But Cooper had the ball in the bucket and dropped it. Cignetti continuing once again, hit the crossbar on a field goal, which was not from the red zone. It was from, I believe, about 45 yards out. And then overthrow a guy for a touchdown in the second half, which I believe was referring to an end zone ball to Elijah Surratt. Surratt was very quiet. Really, I wouldn't call him a non-factor yesterday, but he certainly was not the most impactful receiver, and it wasn't even close. Surratt, 3 catches for 44 yards. And I didn't think, and I'd have to go back and look, but I don't think Elijah Surratt was even targeted in the first half. Also, other names that I did not hear mentioned, other players I didn't see as much as I expected to. Mikhail Kamara and Aiden Fisher, also very quiet. Those guys, of course, on the defensive side. And, you know, it's a new look Indiana roster really all around. Obviously, you've got Fernando Mendoza at quarterback. Save for Kalen Black, it's an entirely new running back room. The supporting cast around him is no longer Justice Ellison and Tyson Lawton. Those were running backs 1 and 2 last year. Kalen Black was the number 3 back. This year, Kalen Black seems to be the number 1. Maybe number 1B with Roman Hemby as 1A. By the way, Hemby had a phenomenal day yesterday. 23 carries for 111 yards. Hemby looked fantastic. And Curt Cignetti was high on him since last year, about 11 months ago when Maryland came to town, and Hemby looked great. He was a highly touted offensive threat before the game, and he certainly paid it off during the game. He got some help from a referee, but I'm sure Indiana is glad to have him in cream and crimson instead of in Maryland Terrapin colors, which are red, white, black, and white. Or excuse me, red, white, yellow, and black. Interesting color combination. But Indiana's rushing offense was phenomenal. Hemby looked great. Kalen Black looked great. Lee Beebe, after fumbling his first carry, ended up with 11 for 73. That's an average of 6.6 yards per carry. You'll take that rushing efficiency all day. That's not the concerning thing about the offense. Like I said, it's the lack of efficiency in the red zone. It feels like Indiana, if you have 500 yards of total offense, which happened multiple times last season, off the top of my head, it happened against Charlotte and Western Illinois in the non-conference. Indiana scored at least 50 points in both of those games. The Charlotte game was kind of a slow start. Western Illinois was never a game. Don't get it twisted. It was 77-3. Probably should have been 77-0. But those games, Indiana was much better. Number one, at converting on explosive play opportunities, which, of course, the number one that comes to mind for me is the drop by Omar Cooper. Again, that was a perfect throw from Fernando Mendoza. A go route up the left seam. Cooper came back over the middle, and Mendoza led him to the spot perfectly. Cooper probably had 5 yards of separation, and the ball just clanked off his hands. He was very visibly upset with himself. He put his hands on his head, was staring at the ground as he decelerated, stopping in the back of the end zone. That's a play that you've got to make, especially when you're that open. And usually, again, this is not to harp on Omar Cooper because he's been great for Indiana. He was fantastic last season, and you knew that he was going to be one of Fernando Mendoza's favorite targets this year. But definitely, you've got to convert on that opportunity going forward. I point to the Illinois game because even though Kennesaw State gave Wake Forest a scare on Friday night, I am not expecting Kennesaw State or Indiana State to be even remotely as anxiety-inducing as yesterday was, especially in the early going for Indiana. I don't think that's any secret. Now, the one thing that does concern me about Kennesaw State, its quarterback is a name that Indiana fans might remember, Dexter Williams, who played for Indiana under Tom Allen. He started the bucket game in 2022, if I remember correctly. He was on the field, I know, at the end of the first half because he suffered a non-contact leg injury, which was very deflating, much like Colton Joseph's 75-yard touchdown run on the first play from scrimmage was yesterday. But Dexter Williams, much like Colton Joseph, is a quarterback that can run. He's a dual threat. Indiana, 2 broken assignments, 2 75-plus yard touchdown rushes by a dual threat quarterback yesterday. So I hope, and I know this will likely be the case, I hope that there's something on tape where Indiana can point to defensively and say, okay, here's what happened, here's how we fix it, because that absolutely cannot happen again. And Cignetti talked about how after Indiana went up 24-7 to start the second half, he said, you thought the route could be on, but it wasn't. Quote, there will be a lot to learn in this tape, and we've got to get better. He knows it. Everybody in the building knows it. I don't think it's any secret Indiana needs to improve. On the flip side, you can justify some of the scuffling as just week one being week one. And that's the thing. Kirk Herbstreit actually made a good point, which I never thought I would say. But Herbstreit made a good point. He was talking to Chris Fowler about this on the broadcast of the LSU Clemson game last night. And he stated that there is no preseason in college football. And I think that's important to remember during the first couple weeks of the season. That is largely why teams schedule bye games where they pay a weaker opponent to come to town, and usually they beat up on them. Indiana paid Old Dominion to give them a scare yesterday. And, of course, there are examples of bye games going awry. App State, Michigan comes to mind, of course, Northern Illinois, Notre Dame last year, which will remain one of the most puzzling upsets in college football for a long time, given how Notre Dame's season ended in the national championship game. But with those bye games, that is effectively your preseason. At least you're hoping that it is. You don't want to jump straight into conference play. Now, that's why I tip my cap to teams that schedule tough out-of-conference opponents. That's also why people rag on Indiana for not doing so, because that's what a lot of top-flight teams tend to do. Those games are scheduled years in advance, but for Alabama, it backfired yesterday. Alabama got really just flat-out dominated by Florida State. People are calling for Kalen DeBoer to be shown to the exit, which is why, and I said this last year, you can take Kalen DeBoer out of Indiana, but you can't take the Indiana out of Kalen DeBoer. Of course, the former Indiana OC on the 2019 team that was coached by Tom Allen, who is now at Clemson, and seeing him in the booth on the ABC broadcast yesterday was very strange. Him and Dabo Swinney in the same room, man, I'd love to be a fly on the wall in there, but I'd rather not be in there for any longer than I would be as a fly on the wall, because I'd imagine it would get pretty unbearable pretty quickly. So, week one jitters, that was the theme of the day yesterday. And I don't want recency bias to cloud your judgment here. Indiana was not at all perfect against Florida International last season. If you remember back to the halftime sideline interview of that game, which, by the way, we need to stop doing sideline interviews during the game. I think it's distracting, useless, and it adds absolutely nothing of value, which is just another way of saying it's useless, on a broadcast. Coaches are always going to give the same canned answers to the same formulaic questions, and it's really nothing that you can't glean just by watching the game. Oh, I think we need to get better running the ball. We had a couple turnovers. We need to clean those up. We'll make the adjustments and talk to you again in the third quarter. Thanks, Coach. Thank you. That's how 90% of those go. But Cignetti's interview at halftime for the Florida International game last year, Coach, how do you feel about the first half, was the sentiment of the question. And Cignetti said, ha. He smirked, sarcastically laughed, and it made it clear that he was going to light up the locker room like a Christmas tree after that interview ended. Indiana came out better in the second half. Now, here, again, Indiana's defense, a couple busted assignments, skewing the numbers, but Old Dominion did not snap the ball in plus territory one time. 3 interceptions thrown by Old Dominion quarterback Colton Joseph, 1 to Amari Farrell, 1 to Lewis Moore, 1 to D'Angelo Pons off a deflection. The defense looked good. The offense, especially on the ground, was ridiculously good. 309 rushing yards. Again, there are positives to take away from this game, but you absolutely have to be more efficient in the red zone against better teams. But Indiana won in week number 1, and that is not something that you could say for everybody inside the admittedly kind of flawed and maybe needing to be abolished AP Top 25. We'll talk about that in just a moment. Keep it here on WGCL. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday. Welcome back to IU Sports Sunday here on WGCL. Nick Rotacap with you on this Labor Day weekend. Happy to conclude the first day of classes with a 4-day weekend because nobody, aside from maybe some freshmen, has classes on Fridays. That's the way it should be because it gives you more time to watch film on Indiana football and do absolutely nothing else. I don't know what you were thinking of, but I was thinking of hitting the film room, and I know that Indiana is going to need to do that leading up to this weekend against Conference USA foe Kennesaw State and former Indiana quarterback Dexter Williams. Wake Forest, you have a lot to answer for because Kennesaw State nearly beat you in Winston-Salem, North Carolina in a thrilling game that ended 10-9 in favor of the Demon Deacons. I say thrilling sarcastically, of course, in the same way that Wyoming is a scenic oceanfront destination. That game was thrilling. Kennesaw State, 300 yards of total offense against Wake Forest and only scoring 9 points. So maybe it'll be a battle of futility here in Bloomington next weekend. Indiana had 500 total yards of offense and came away with 2 offensive touchdowns. Bunch of failed trips to the red zone. That's a game that Curt Cignetti will, I'm sure, have a field day with in the film room. But it is definitely important to point out that Dexter Williams is a dual-threat quarterback, and he had a very interesting career at Indiana. That much is for certain. Remember the game against Michigan State in 2022. One of the more intriguing, puzzling, perplexing games Indiana ever played under Tom Allen. That was a game where Indiana trailed 24-7 at halftime, and then the Hoosiers ended up winning 39-31 in double overtime. Shaun Shivers, does that name ring a bell? Well, he had 115 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns in that game. Shivers is now an assistant coach at Eastern Michigan. So that's an idea of what he's up to. Dexter Williams in that game, he was Indiana's starting quarterback as both Connor Bazelak and Jack Tuttle were injured. Williams, 2 of 7 for 31 yards in the air. So, yeah, when I say dual threat, I think I'm being kind. Now, he's certainly improved as a passer since then. But that was a particularly cold and snowy and disgusting game weather-wise. That much is for sure. There were no wide receivers that caught a pass in that game for Indiana. A.J. Barner, tight end, and Josh Henderson, running back, were the only 2 pass catchers. Shivers had 115 rushing yards and 2 touchdowns on that day in East Lansing as Indiana improved to 4-7 in 2022. Dexter Williams had 16 for 86 and a touchdown on the ground. So that, I think, is important to remember, that Dexter Williams can find ways to win games even if he's not doing it through the air. That's something Indiana is absolutely going to have to be mindful of. And I know you're thinking, oh, well, this is Kennesaw State and it's a bye game, so why are you getting so uptight about it? Well, and this is kind of, again, coach speak, but anybody can beat anybody. And we saw that yesterday throughout the probably should be abolished and definitely flawed in its methodology AP Top 25. Let's start with the big one, Texas-Ohio State, and get this out of the way right now. Texas was horrible against Ohio State, particularly Arch Manning. I saw an article from The Athletic yesterday, and the lead was, I'm paraphrasing, there's no sugarcoating it. Arch Manning mostly stunk against Ohio State. And I think the caveat there, because it is important to realize those are 2 teams with absolutely loaded defenses. And refusing to acknowledge that would be extremely flawed analysis. But Arch Manning was off target on over 1/3 of his throws. Now, he was 17 of 30 for 170 passing yards, a touchdown, and a pick. Also, 38 yards on 10 rushing attempts. But Texas got into the red zone just twice and did not score in the red zone. Just 7 points. Julian Sayin did not look great either. So, again, you've got 2 quarterbacks starting in their first ever games as the official starters. You know, Arch Manning got some playing time behind Quinn Ewers last year, who, by the way, I don't think Quinn Ewers was very good. But Texas being the preseason number one, I think, again, there's no way Texas is the best team in the country. I'm hoping that people are starting to realize that preseason polls are flawed because you cannot. I think it would be easier if the transfer portal was not as widely utilized as it is now. But you cannot even come close to accurately evaluating teams just by the roster alone. You cannot evaluate them without games being played. And I don't know that the AP poll is ever going to go away because you're obviously going to need something to sell early season games. And I think Texas-Ohio State sells itself. Certainly two of the most storied programs in all of college football, two of the most recognizable brands in any sport in the United States, a historic venue in Ohio Stadium, and, of course, the lead-up to it being Lee Corso's final college game day pick, in which he correctly selected Ohio State to beat Texas. I think that matchup sells itself without putting the AP rankings beside it. I know you're going to want, you wanted number one versus number two, and they didn't rank Ohio State number two. But why do we do this to ourselves? Why did we put Kansas State back in the top 25 after Kansas State went over to Ireland and lost to Iowa State in week 0? Kansas State needed a last-second touchdown catch from Joe Jackson to beat North Dakota 38-35, the 17th-ranked Kansas State Wildcats taking down North Dakota. That game looked like it might have been in hand for North Dakota. It was 35-31. I believe in the final 2 minutes of that game. I don't remember for sure. But North Dakota looked like they had that game in the bag. It didn't happen that way. But Kansas State, a week after going to Ireland, struggled against North Dakota. I want to also take a moment to say that anybody from here on out who has agreed to go to Ireland to open the college football season is categorically insane. Because, of course, jet lag is going to be a factor. You're sitting on a plane for hours on end, both going there and coming back. And in the case of Kansas State, you're expected to play another game a week later. Man. On top of classes starting. I don't envy anybody involved with Kansas State football right now because that is an absolutely brutal stretch. Just on your body. I don't wish that upon anyone. But Kansas State did not look good against Iowa State last week, and both of those teams, obviously, were having to deal with the same situation. So Kansas State is an example of why preseason rankings are flawed. I think the AP voters this year are very high on teams that have returning quarterbacks, Penn State being one of them, Kansas State as well with Avery Johnson. I don't know. I am not a big believer in preseason rankings. It would be one thing if college football had a couple preseason games. Obviously, that's not going to happen. But I think there could be a world out there where we wait until maybe just wait a week. Wait until week 2. But then again, on the flip side, we wouldn't have week 1 upsets like Alabama losing to Florida State 31-17 in Tallahassee. Boston College transfer Thomas Castellanos celebrating with Seminole fans on the field after Florida State took down the 8th-ranked Crimson Tide. And hey, Alabama, winning in week 1 is not for everyone. It's hard sometimes. But people, I think, are starting to realize that, well, welcome to reality, not every coach is Nick Saban. It's Alabama's first week 1 loss since 2001, which is an absurd testament to the consistency of that program over the last 24 years. But Alabama was bad yesterday. Bad. They got outplayed, particularly by Castellanos. 152 yards through the air, 72 on the ground, and a touchdown as well. What a turnaround this could be for Florida State. Because you think back to 2023, 13-0, missed the college football playoff to none other than Alabama. Following season, hoping to redeem yourselves in the eyes of the general public who did not believe you belonged in the playoff after getting embarrassed by Georgia 63-3 in your bowl game. You go 2-10. Disaster. DJ Uiagalelei was not at all what anybody thought he would be at quarterback. So this is a fantastic start to the season for Florida State. But on the flip side, man, how the mighty fall. Kalen DeBoer having some questions to answer, but I'm sure he feels a little bit safer in the fact that he has a $70 million buyout. So I don't think he's going to get fired anytime soon. A lot of chaos around week one beyond Indiana's 27-14 win over Old Dominion. Keep it right here. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday on WGCL. Back here on IU Sports Sunday, Nick Rotocap with you on the Labor Day Sunday as we kick off the show this year. A lot of chaos around college football in week one. And before we head to the top of the hour, I want to touch on something that ESPN said, which, wow, fork found in the kitchen, I know. But ESPN sends out a story to those of us who have notifications on for college football. And the lead is, quote, "Week one shows us that off-season narratives mean nothing until games are played." Story by David Hale. ESPN is telling me that off-season narratives don't matter and that we should wait until the games are played before we judge teams. Now, hold on. Hold on. Just a moment for me. Because if you remember last season and even this off-season, even week 0, Heather Dinich, Indiana alum, I'm looking directly at you. You were talking about Indiana before a game between Kansas State and Iowa State. When Indiana, now bear with me, hadn't played a game yet this year. Why would you preview the matchup at hand when you could rag on Indiana? Because Indiana's historically bad. Wow. Groundbreaking discovery, I know. Indiana's historically bad. So we should continue to diminish them before they've even played a game. But ESPN is then going to turn around and tell me that we should wait until games are played to judge teams? The irony could not be any better. This is why, among a lot of other reasons, nobody takes ESPN seriously like they used to. Because ESPN will say whatever it takes to get clicks and drum up an audience. Especially if it means giving false credit to the SEC, largely for accomplishing nothing. Just for existing. The SEC is supposedly better than everyone else. It blows my mind. The irony. Did nobody see that? ESPN has done nothing all offseason but manufacture narratives. And they want to tell us not to listen to the offseason narratives and wait for the games to be played? It kills me. You have talking heads on ESPN all of last year saying that Indiana couldn't handle an SEC schedule and they'd be middle of the pack at best. The Big Ten is bad. Now, which team won the national championship last year? I was a Big Ten team. Who did they play? They didn't play an SEC team. The SEC has not had a team in the national championship in 2 years. But the way ESPN talks about them, you would think that the SEC is the number one every single year. And I think the SEC superiority narrative completely fell on its face with the advent of NIL. The SEC is no longer the superior conference in all of college football, but ESPN still thinks it is. And you cannot make this up. You absolutely cannot make it up. That, again, Heather Dinich, an ESPN alum, an Indiana alum, who maybe I don't know, maybe she didn't have the experience at IU that she wanted, and that's why she hates IU now. But you have Heather Dinich and others like Paul Feinbaum casting judgment on IU before even playing a game, saying that Indiana's going to regress this year. But now you're telling us not to put any stock in offseason narratives? You cannot play both sides of the same coin as an outlet and expect people to take you seriously. ESPN should not be the preeminent voice on college football because it is clear they have absolutely no clue what they're doing. And if you cannot see that irony, then you're lost. There's no hope. If you can't see the irony in that, I think it is hilarious that ESPN is telling us not to listen to offseason narratives, a lot of which they manufacture and push. So again, don't take ESPN too seriously because they'll say whatever it takes to get clicks and pander and hope that you don't notice. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday. Back here on IU Sports Sunday, Nick Rotocap with you on this Labor Day weekend. Thank you so much for joining us. This is the morning after Indiana's 27-14 win over Old Dominion in Week 1 of Year 2 under head coach Curt Cignetti. Not every Big Ten team fared as well as Indiana did. I think it's important to keep things in perspective. It can always be worse. You think back to the offseason, one of the key sagas in this NIL era that involves former Indiana quarterbacks coach Tino Sunseri, who is now the UCLA Bruins offensive coordinator, was surrounding Tennessee quarterback Nico Iamaleava, who was pedestrian at best playing for Tennessee. Remember, at the bottom of the last hour, we were talking about ESPN's manufactured SEC superiority narratives. And that narrative got blown up in the college football playoff, especially last year when Tennessee went to Ohio State and really looked like they didn't even belong there. Kirk Herbstreit, at least Indiana gave Notre Dame a fight instead of laying down and dying like Tennessee did. Tennessee's offense last year quarterbacked by Nico Iamaleava, who was very highly touted as a quarterback prospect and seemingly disappeared in a big moment. Who else but Nico to make headlines for disappearing again? He transferred to UCLA in what was effectively a trade of quarterbacks. Iamaleava goes to Westwood, California, and Joey Aguilar transfers from UCLA to Tennessee. So you effectively have a trade of quarterbacks. Now, Joey Aguilar looked great yesterday as Tennessee beat Syracuse 45-26. Aguilar 16 of 28 for 247 yards through the air and 3 passing touchdowns as the Vols put up nearly 500 total yards of offense. But Nico Iamaleava was not having fun for the Bruins. UCLA got blown out yesterday. 43-10 losers to Utah. The Utes not quarterbacked by Cameron Rising, which I know is kind of shocking. Cameron Rising is an old man. But the Utes controlled that game from the jump. 43-10. It was 23-7 at halftime. Nico stunk up the joint. 11 of 22 for 136 yards through the air. 47 rushing yards, a touchdown and a pick. Not good. Not good. So you're talking about a guy who had the reins at Tennessee as a youngin', transferred out in a high-profile saga. Josh Heupel, the Tennessee head coach, the sentiment was very clear. We're better off without him. And I think he was right. 1 week, I know, not a lot to go off of, but it was a puzzling move because Strictly from a financial standpoint, I cannot imagine UCLA's NIL base for football is even with or better than Tennessee. Because as somebody who went to the Rose Bowl last year to cover UCLA Indiana, there were almost as many Indiana fans there as there were UCLA fans. I don't think that UCLA would be a primo transfer portal destination for a quarterback seeking a lot of money. On the other side, or to go along with that, I should say, California's state income tax has got to be higher than Tennessee's. As someone who worked in Tennessee this past summer, I am 99.9% certain that California's income tax is higher. So Nico, even if he was making the exact same amount of money, if he was making more money, would actually take home less because of income tax. So from a financial standpoint, the move kind of raised my eyebrows. And this is what kind of speculation you get when NIL figures are not public. You have rumors, you have estimates, you have valuations, but nobody knows how much anybody is actually making. Now, I'm willing to bet that Nico moving from Tennessee to UCLA after the hubbub that he raised, all the commotion that his camp made about how, Tennessee wasn't giving him what he wanted. You lost 43-10 to Utah at home in week 1. So maybe you should have thought twice about demanding what was probably an ungodly sum of money if your performances aren't going to take the same leap. I bring this up because UCLA comes to town and takes on Indiana on October 25th. Former quarterbacks coach Tino Sunseri will be back on the sidelines in Bloomington, though this time it'll be for the opposition. That's after Indiana's tough stretch of games from late September into October. Illinois, Iowa, Oregon, Michigan State. Iowa and Oregon both on the road. You could go anywhere from 1-3 to 4-0 in that stretch, and it would not surprise me. But that UCLA game could be a very bad time for Nico Iamaleava and the UCLA Bruins, especially if last year was anything to go by. When Curt Cignetti ran circles around Deshaun Foster, and Indiana won that game convincingly. I just think it's tough to build a fan base for college football in Southern California. One of the most saturated markets when it comes to sports. I mean, you've got 2 NFL teams, 1.5 MLB teams in Los Angeles. I'm really not going to count the Angels as a full team because they don't play in LA. You've got USC football, which I would argue is the bigger of the 2 programs. And you've got soccer, you've got basketball, you've got a ton of attention. I just don't think that UCLA football is very in demand in its own market, which again, the attendance at the Rose Bowl in the game that I covered, which a primetime matchup in a conference game, you would think it would be better, but there were a ton of Indiana fans there last year. I don't know, maybe things have changed, but things certainly not changing on the field for UCLA. So that's a matchup to keep an eye on when UCLA comes to town in what will be the second to last home game of the season, just over 2 months from now. But Indiana's got all eyes on Kennesaw State, the second of 3 non-conference games. Indiana hoping to iron some things out after a very unconvincing 13-point victory over Old Dominion yesterday at the newly named Merchants Bank Field at Memorial Stadium. I think most people are just going to call it Memorial Stadium. But the novelty, certainly nice, at least for a little bit. Definitely some kinks to iron out, especially in the passing game and on the red zone offense side of things. Fernando Mendoza, talking to the media after the game, said that it wasn't up to his standard. He took a lot of accountability for it, which I think is important for the quarterback to come out and be aware of the areas for improvement. Mendoza certainly did not mince words. I tip my cap to him there. I think it's tough when you're coming in, you're running a new offense, you're working with a bunch of new receivers as well. playing in a stadium you've never been in before as a player in an actual game. Obviously, Indiana practices in Memorial Stadium, but it's another thing when fans are in attendance. So I think it's important that Mendoza took accountability, and I think a lot of it had to do with his timing. Mendoza at Cal was notorious for having to run for his life on every play because his offensive line wouldn't hold up. But Mendoza at Indiana isn't going to have to do that. Indiana's offensive line was great, and Mendoza gave them a lot of props, saying, yeah, it was great that I had that much time to throw, but ideally I want to get the ball to receivers as they are breaking out of their routes, as opposed to waiting for them to come out of their routes. That's something that I think once you have a film session, once you have time to diagnose what you need to work on, I think you're going to see Mendoza take some strides in the coming weeks. And again, Week 1 jitters, a theme across the country. It is far from unique. Far from unique. But I do think it's important that Indiana irons those things out. And, you can say, well, you've got a couple weeks until Illinois, but you absolutely cannot rest on your laurels because come college football playoff selection time, there's going to be scrutiny if, say, there are two teams that are 11-1 in the regular season, or 10-2. I think 10-2 would probably be the danger zone. 9-3 certainly dangerous, but 10-2. Let's say you have two teams that are 10-2. It might come down to who was more convincing in non-conference games. There are a whole host of other factors there, but you would like to see Indiana have a more convincing showing against these out-of-conference opponents, especially Kennesaw State and Indiana State. Old Dominion, I think, could make some noise in the Sun Belt this year. That would certainly help Indiana's case. But you've got to beat up on Kennesaw State and Indiana State. Make their lives miserable. And make Illinois a little nervous. Because I'm sure Illinois is licking their chops after seeing Indiana's poor red zone offense and missed opportunities on explosive plays yesterday. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday on WGCL. Back here on IU Sports Sunday, Nick Rodecap with you on this Labor Day weekend. Thanks so much for joining us. Week 1 of college football is almost in the books. A couple games today. With the NFL not kicking off quite yet, college football games can be played on Sundays, and we've got a couple good matchups in store tonight. No Big Ten teams in action, although maybe perhaps kind of candidate for Big Ten expansion. Notre Dame is in action at 7:30 against Miami on ABC. The appetizer, Virginia Tech visits South Carolina at 3 o'clock on ESPN. Maryland's athletic director said, I believe it was earlier this week, that the Big Ten might expand again. Which, what? But it was James Smith, the new Maryland athletic director, said in an interview that the Big Ten might add even more teams. The conference reportedly eyeing 20 teams by 2030. What? I think, one, that is a very stupid idea. I think 18 teams is already too many. There is very little, if any, parity in the world of Big Ten scheduling anymore. You remember when the Big Ten had divisions, the Big Ten East was almost always much stronger than the West. Because in the East, you had, and I know this right now, this is going to sound crazy to say, Michigan State used to be good. You had Michigan State, Michigan, Ohio State, and Penn State in the same division. Now, in a year when all four of those teams were good, Indiana almost always went 0-4 in those games. In the Big Ten West, you had, now Purdue actually made the Big Ten championship game in one of the final years that the Big Ten had divisions. You had Iowa, you had Minnesota, Wisconsin, Nebraska. Not exactly needle movers, although don't tell Nebraska fans I said that because them and their 400 consecutive fake sellouts are going to come for me. We'll talk about Dylan Raiola in a second. But Maryland's athletic director, James E. Smith, There are a lot of James Smiths out there, I'm sure. But he said that he thinks that the Big Ten is eyeing expansion. 20 teams by 2030. On a recent interview with Inside Maryland Radio, he floated this idea. Brett McMurphy, perennial clickbaiter from On3, who loves to hate on Indiana, loves hating Indiana, thinks about Indiana 24/7. But Brett McMurphy thinks that it may be a team or teams, because you need 2 to make it to 20, from the ACC or the Big 12. It would be so funny if Indiana added, if the Big Ten added, for example, North Carolina and Duke, Clemson and Duke, somebody from, one of the real moneymakers in the ACC. It would also be really funny if they added Florida State, because then you would have a conference game potentially between Florida State and Washington. Not like Rutgers, Washington isn't already absurd enough. But apparently, according to the rumor mill that is college sports reporting in this day and age, North Carolina and Virginia are viewed as pretty attractive to both the Big Ten and the SEC. Why would we consider adding a team like Virginia to the Southeastern Conference? I don't know. Nothing makes sense anymore. But with conference realignment, everybody is out to make as much money as they can. Notre Dame has been floated as an expansion target for a while. Everybody says, "Oh, Notre Dame needs to join a conference." They're basically in the ACC unofficially. They play an ACC football schedule, but they're in an independent, and because they are independent, all the money that the Irish make during football season goes into their pockets. Usually when a team makes the national championship, the payout is divided up amongst other teams in the conference. Notre Dame got to keep all of it last year. Why in the world would you want that to change if you're up in South Bend? I wouldn't. You've got a lucrative TV contract with NBC, and you do not need a conference to make you stand out. I don't think Notre Dame's ever going to join a conference. But some people say, "Oh, Notre Dame should join the Big Ten." And that's where you get into the other sports. Notre Dame is in the Big Ten for hockey and lacrosse. They're in the ACC for most other sports. I don't think that's going to change for the Irish. And I don't think it should. I think that would be a very bad decision on their part for Notre Dame. As far as former Indiana coaches go, Tom Allen and Clemson got off to a tough start last night. In the battle of the two schools in the Southeast whose stadiums are both nicknamed Death Valley. Also, the battle of two schools with a tiger as their mascot. So I think it's only fair that because Tom Allen and the Clemson Tigers lost to Brian Kelly and the LSU Tigers, that Clemson changes the nickname of its stadium. By the way, Clemson's official name for its stadium is Memorial Stadium. So I now know of 4 Memorial Stadiums with connections to Tom Allen, either through the Big Ten in the case of Indiana, Nebraska, and Illinois, and Clemson. Tom Allen being the defensive coordinator at Clemson. I think it's only fair that Clemson changes the nickname of its stadium to Critical but Stable Condition Valley, because obviously LSU proved that it's not quite fatal. Kalen DeBoer, we talked about it a little bit earlier, but you can take Kalen DeBoer out of Indiana. However, you cannot take the Indiana out of Kalen DeBoer. Losing to Florida State, a team that went 2-10 last season. It goes to show how fast things can change on both sides of the coin in the transfer portal era. Transfer quarterback Thomas Castellanos diced up Alabama yesterday, was convincingly better behind center for Florida State than DJ Uiagalelei was. Kind of puzzling because DJU, a lot of people were high on him at the start of last season. The bottom fell out of there pretty quickly. As for Indiana's transfer signal caller, Fernando Mendoza, a lot of people, I think, myself included, I'll throw myself into this group, thought that he would be a 1-to-1 upgrade to Curtis Rourke. He's got the arm talent, and as far as we know, he has 2 intact ACLs. Rourke, of course, played all of last season on a torn ACL, and nobody even knew about it until after the season was over. But Mendoza, through one game, again, you've got 11 more regular season games, but showing some of the same hiccups that Indiana had to deal with Curtis Rourke at the start of last year. Mendoza, though, looked good running the ball. He got out of the pocket a few times. But I do think it will take some time for him to get used to actually having time to throw. And Cignetti said that they've been trying to iron out some of the timing things with him. And Curt Cignetti, of course, very adamant that Fernando Mendoza has made lots of strides throughout the spring. But still some things to work on. And again, that is far from unique. But definitely the red zone offense needs to be to the top of that list. Cignetti opening his press conference talking about missed opportunities and how Indiana did not play as well as it should have. That's, quote, a flat-out fact. And Mendoza making noise on the ground, as did Indiana's running back core of Kalen Black, Lee Beebe, and Roman Hemby. The latter of whom, Hemby, going for over 100 yards. But Mendoza, Cignetti, quote, made some good plays. He left some out there, got off rhythm a couple of times. And Cignetti continues that they've been trying to speed up his process, going from read to read, going through his progressions and making a decision, getting the ball out of his hand quickly. Just a little tick closer in the timing department. And I think you'll see Fernando Mendoza take a step forward. You're hoping, again, that you iron that out on tape and that you progress week to week in game situations as well. An important thing in the early part of the season as well is that Indiana stays healthy. Bryson Bonds was hobbled after a kickoff yesterday. Tried to put some weight on his leg. Couldn't do it. So hopefully he is good to go by next weekend, but he got the attention of the training staff. And other than that, it looked like Indiana got out of yesterday healthy. We'll see. Talk to Cignetti tomorrow, and if he brings up any injuries, it'll be paramount that Indiana gets healthy going into conference play. Old Dominion had a number of players go down. It's the first time that guys are actually allowed to hit each other and tackle, and definitely something to keep an eye on over the next couple of weeks. But credit to Curt Cignetti because he gave Old Dominion props before week 1 in his presser, saying that Old Dominion and other Sun Belt teams have been known to make noise in the early season. Last year, Old Dominion played a lot of close games, including week 1 against South Carolina. Old Dominion fumbled inside its own 10-yard line twice in that game, and South Carolina had touchdown drives of 2 and 6 yards. Cignetti called them extremely fortunate to beat Old Dominion. That final score was 23-19 South Carolina. So Old Dominion coming in and giving Indiana a bit of a jolt was not at all shocking, I'm sure, for Curt Cignetti. Doesn't make it any easier knowing the way Indiana played was very subpar. But the Sun Belt might be on high alert for Old Dominion, especially if quarterback Colton Joseph can take advantage of missed assignments like he did against Indiana yesterday. And I'm sure that is something Kennesaw State is going to circle and say, okay, Indiana missed this assignment twice, and it directly led to 14 points. Also, the red zone offense got close inside the 10, inside the 5, and didn't punch it in a couple of times. Had to settle for field goals. Missed a field goal from outside the red zone. Indiana left a lot of points on the board yesterday. And that's something Curt Cignetti said after the game. His teams in the past generally haven't done. When they've had opportunities to score, they've scored. So it'll be interesting to see how Cignetti and his staff navigate that in the early part of the season. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday. Back here on IU Sports Sunday, Nick Rotocap with you on this Labor Day weekend after a chaotic first full Saturday, I should say, of college football. Indiana needing to iron some things out, but everybody involved taking accountability, saying that they know it needs to get better, and it needs to get better quickly. That is the encouraging sign from yesterday. I think, big picture for Indiana, there's a lower floor overall, but a higher ceiling. And what I mean by that is Indiana could potentially go 8-4 this year, which if you're looking at that and calling it a down year, then, wow, that goes to show how much the paradigm of Indiana football has shifted just over the last 12 months. I also think Indiana could still go 11-1. I don't know about undefeated. I think the likelihood of Indiana beating all of Illinois, Oregon, and Penn State, the three marquee matchups a lot of people have circled, myself included, the odds of Indiana winning all three of those games are pretty low, let's be honest. Illinois is definitely I'm not going to say the easiest game because none of those games are easy. I don't think Iowa's going to be easy for Indiana just because Kinnick Stadium is a tough place to play, even if Iowa may or may not have actually discovered the forward pass with quarterback Mark Gronowski, not Gronkowski. But there are 3 or 4 games that are not going to be smooth sailing at all for Indiana. And I'm not concerned because of the way they played yesterday. You're going to see improvement on an execution basis between now and when Illinois comes to town on September 20th. What I'm concerned about is that Indiana has not shown yet that it can handle a difficult road environment with any semblance of stability on the offensive side. Defensively, you think back to Ohio State last year. I had a pit in my stomach before that game because my gut told me it was going to be bad, and it was. That the wheels all started coming off last year at Ohio State with a fumble on a punt. James Evans, the punter, dropped the snap. Then later on, you give up a punt return touchdown. You set up your defense with short fields because of self-inflicted mistakes. The silent count doesn't work. Ohio State times it up, and the NFL-level talent on that defense does what it does best and completely wreaks havoc on your offensive game plan. Notre Dame, loud crowd. Curtis Rourke throws an interception. Jeremiah Love rips off a 98-yard touchdown run, and from there, the offense just cannot execute anything, cannot get in rhythm. Holding Notre Dame to 27 points, and I wouldn't say holding Notre Dame, giving up 27 points, feels like with the way Indiana's offense had performed that season in 2024, Indiana might have had a chance if something would have gone right, but nothing went right. So the concern that I have with Indiana is that Curt Cignetti has not shown that he can coach for Indiana, at least, in a big-ticket road environment in a Power 5 conference. Autzen Stadium was difficult for Ohio State last year. Iowa City's going to be tough. Kinnick Stadium is a difficult place to play. Penn State, 100,000 people, just like Ohio State. Indiana has a tough Big Ten schedule ahead. And I think Indiana could lose all 3 of those games. I also think Indiana could win 2 of 3. I think Iowa, of those 3, is the most winnable. And let's think back to 2023. Indiana nearly beat Penn State with, as we know now, a much more subpar head coach and less talent on the roster overall. That's just a fact. Indiana in 2023 was nowhere near as good as Indiana is right now, talent-wise and coaching-wise. So I do think Indiana can win a couple of those games. I think if you win 2 of those 3, and I'm talking now about Illinois, Oregon, and Penn State as well. I don't know that Iowa is going to sway the committee unless Iowa ends up having a really good season. But I think that realistically, if you beat either Oregon or Penn State and you take care of business against the teams that you are supposed to in the Big Ten, the likes of UCLA, Maryland, Wisconsin, and Purdue, I think you're probably back in the playoff, much to the chagrin of the talking heads at ESPN. So I do think it's important to keep some perspective. It is hard to win on the road in college football. I don't think that's a secret. Texas, who everybody had heaps of expectation for, especially their quarterback, Arch Manning, who spent 2 years behind Quinn Ewers, thinking, oh, wow, this is going to be Arch Manning's coming out party against Ohio State. No. The only thing that came out of yesterday is that Texas had no answers for Ohio State defensively. Held scoreless until the final 4 minutes of the game. Ouch. And again, a huge credit to Ohio State's defense. But I think it goes to show, one, Ohio State's coaching staff is really freaking good, in case that wasn't clear already. 2, the Big Ten, the top flight teams in the Big Ten, are on level footing, if not better than, the top flight teams in the SEC. I know ESPN's not going to like that. But the playing field is much more level now with the advent of NIL than it used to be. Almost makes you wonder what was going on in the SEC before paying players was legal. You're listening to IU Sports Sunday. Back here on IU Sports Sunday, Nick Rotocap with you. ESPN's Football Power Index has just been updated, and you can't make it up. You just can't make it up. Texas lost to Ohio State yesterday. Looked horrible. Didn't score until the final 4 minutes of the game. Guess who's still number 1 in the FPI? If you said Texas, you win. I don't know what you win, but you win more than Texas has in the last 48 hours. The Longhorns remain at number 1 in the FPI, despite losing head-to-head to the team that is only number 3, Ohio State. Looking down the rest of the FPI, Indiana is 29th. Somehow Kansas State is still above Indiana in the FPI. Kansas State is 28th, dropping 10 spots after barely beating North Dakota yesterday. But Kansas State is somehow above Indiana. I think that the FPI algorithm, which, by the way, features a handful of SEC, Big 12, and ACC teams, much more than any other conference. The Big Ten is represented by Ohio State, Penn State, USC, and Oregon in the top 10. 4 representatives plus Michigan at number 20. 6 in the top 25. Everybody else, save for Notre Dame, is a member of either the SEC, the Big 12, or the ACC, all of whom, the astute among you will know, are partnered with ESPN. So I think part of the FPI algorithm that ESPN doesn't tell us about is a clause that if this team is in a conference that has a media rights contract with ESPN, then we boost them by a factor of 4. I don't know. I'm pulling a number out of thin air there. But Utah, this is interesting. Utah rises 26 spots in the FPI. The Utes now at number 19 after beating UCLA. That doesn't make much sense because UCLA is not good. Somehow Indiana loses 4 spots after winning yesterday. Let's see where Alabama is. Oh, Alabama is 13th after losing very uninspiringly to Florida State. Bama falls 10 spots. And again, this is where I think the preseason brand bias comes into play. Bama being at number 3 to start the season is laughable. I'm not just saying that with the power of hindsight. I'm saying that because Bama was underwhelming last year. But just because it's Alabama and Ryan Williams is a phenom, yeah, go ahead and slot him inside the top 5. Put him on the podium. Who even cares? It just doesn't make much sense to me. I mean, it makes sense, but it doesn't make sense. And what I mean by that is I understand that it's ESPN and therefore it's going to be biased, but I don't understand how you can honestly look at this methodology and think that it's not flawed. Purely because, just look at the Kansas State-Indiana comparison. You cannot look me in the eye and tell me with a straight face that Kansas State is better than Indiana. You just can't. Kansas State has looked uninspired at best in both games so far this season. And you cannot put them above Indiana in good faith. Texas cannot still be at number 1 after losing to Ohio State and looking stagnant at best. Certainly questionable, especially on offense. For all the hype around Arch Manning, he's supposed to, I think, rise to the occasion better than that. And I understand Ohio Stadium is a tough place to play. But people were hyping this guy as a Heisman contender. I think if Arch Manning was named Arch Smith or Arch Jones or Arch Mendoza, then he would not have anywhere close to the amount of hype that he does. But because he is a Manning, he's supposed to be the next number 1 overall pick, future number 1 overall pick at quarterback. No. There is absolutely no way, especially after yesterday. I understand he looked good in limited playing time, but now that teams are prepping for him and not Quinn Ewers every week, and also Arch Manning is not playing against ULM, I think people are going to realize he's not as good as everyone says he is. I would take Fernando Mendoza over Arch Manning. I would do it right now. I wouldn't take either of them in the first round, and there was a CBS sports writer that projected Fernando Mendoza to go first overall. Probably not, but I admire your admiration. I tip my cap to you. But no, Texas absolutely should not even be in the top 10 in the FPI. They're probably going to remain in the AP top 5 come Monday, which, again, should not be the case, but it will be, because the problem is you use the preseason rankings as the control group, if you will, for the rest of the season. So teams that are overrated at the beginning remain overrated throughout the season. You might see that with Alabama, even after losing to Florida State. Honestly, I think Alabama should drop to around 20th, if they're even still ranked at all. They're not going to, but they should. Kansas State should be unranked, no question. I don't care that they beat North Dakota. They nearly lost at home to North Dakota after losing to another fringe-ranked team in Iowa State, which, by the way, Iowa State was below Kansas State in the FPI until yesterday, or until, I guess, today, after the games that were played yesterday. I just don't get it. I get it because it's ESPN, but I don't understand how people can take ESPN seriously with respect to its evaluation of college football. Indiana, first noon kick of the season, and maybe the first noon kick for a while. This weekend against Kennesaw State, Dexter Williams, the former Indiana quarterback, will be in Memorial Stadium once again. Saw a few former IU athletes yesterday. I walked right past Trace Jackson Davis and Anthony Leal, so that was interesting. Darren DeVries and some of the IU basketball recruits are in the building as well. Good to see them. Trace Jackson Davis is a lot taller than I thought. Once you get up close, I barely got up to his shoulder, I think. And he's in the NBA, and I'm not, and there's a good reason for that. But they got to watch an anxiety-inducing win, I think, at times. But a win is a win, and that's what you'll take in week 1, because that is far from Guaranteed. You've been listening to WGCL. This is IU Sports Sunday. Have a good rest of your Sunday morning and afternoon. We'll talk to you next week right here on WGCL.